Here's what you should have done if you were a Nazi and you wanted to win the war. You should have enslaved the Jews and the Gypsies and had them work, right? You should have had them work for the benefit of the victory, and then if you wanted to, you liquidate them afterwards. That's the logical thing to do if you want to win. And we assume that Hitler wanted to win. But that's not a very intelligent assumption. Why would you assume that? He wasn't exactly a good guy. So why should we assume that he was aiming at the good that he was promoting, even in his own terms, right? The glorious, everlasting Third Reich, right? That'll rule for 1,000 years and be a bastion of civilization and music, because that's the sort of thing he purported to be interested in. Well, so what do you do with the Jews and the Gypsies? Well, round them up, fine. Enslave them, fine. You don't kill them. You certainly don't devote a substantial proportion of your war resources while you're losing to accelerate the rate at which the extermination is taking place. Because that's a bit counterproductive, unless what you're aiming at is the maximum possible mayhem in the shortest period of time. Well, so what happened as the Germans started to lose the war? Did Hitler lose faith in his own ability? No, he believed that the Germans had betrayed him with weakness. And so he was perfectly willing to accelerate the rate at which Germany was losing the war. And so when Hitler and his minions had the choice, here's the choice. You can suspend your unnecessary demolition of people, win the damn war, and then pick it up afterwards. Or while you're losing, you can just accelerate the mayhem, even though it's counterproductive. It's like, what'd they pick? Well, they picked to accelerate the mayhem. And so to me, there's an old psychoanalytic idea. I think this was derived by Jung. If you can't figure out what someone is doing or why, look at the outcome and infer the motivation. If it produces mayhem, perhaps it was aiming at mayhem. Now, you have to use that dictum carefully. If someone's irritating you, maybe it's because you're irritable and you should sort yourself out, but maybe it's because they're actually aiming at irritating you. And that's the actual motivation. So perhaps not, but it's another tool in your analytical armament. So, and so you see, well, and this is the thing about warfare that's so interesting about because you can attribute it to territoriality. You can attribute it to a war for resources. That's what I would say, wretchedly simple-minded economists presume. People fight over scarce resources. It's like, hey, we're a little bit more sophisticated than that. And first of all, what resources are you talking about? The bloody Inuit had nothing. They lived perfectly well. What did they have? Snow and seal blubber. People can live in unbelievably deprived conditions. And so the idea that there are natural resources that we fight over because there's a shortage of them is a pretty oversimplified view of human beings. It's like, well, why do people fight? Well, maybe they fight sometimes for good reasons. But very, very frequently, they fight for bad reasons. And those bad reasons are personal as well as sociocultural and economic. If you were a Nazi prison guard, for example, whatever pathologies you were carrying around in your destructive little soul, whatever element of Cain was deeply embedded in you, had the opportunity to be manifest fully at every moment of your waking existence, right? You had these people who were completely beholden to you with no rights whatsoever, to whom you could do whatever your evil little heart determined. Think, well, maybe that was a motivation for putting them there to begin with. And all the cover story about, well, we're trying to build the Third Reich and we're trying to stabilize the state and we're trying to do all these good things. Maybe that's just a cover story for the real motivation, which is nothing but what? The construction of death camps that killed 6 million people. How about that? And the obliteration of 120 million people on the planet, and the leaving of Europe in ruins. Maybe that was the motivation. Or are we going to attribute to Hitler the highest possible motives? Say, no, it's an archetypal manifestation of Cain. Now, he's going to put up a front that says, well, I'm your savior. It's like, well, destructive people think that Cain is their savior.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a tough one, a really heavy but super important topic. We're going to try to understand the motivations behind the Nazis' actions in World War II. We've got some thought-provoking stuff to unpack, including some really interesting observations from Jordan Peterson and some in-depth commentary on Nazi ideology.
Yeah, it's a complex subject for sure. Disturbing too. But, getting to the why behind these horrific events is crucial if we're serious about preventing history from repeating itself.
Absolutely. One thing from Jordan Peterson really stuck with me when we were prepping for this. He asked this question, like, If the Nazis were purely focused on winning the war, wouldn't it have made more sense strategically to enslave the Jewish population for labor instead of, exterminating them?
Yeah.
Especially when the war started going against them, it just seems so counterintuitive.
Yeah, it really does. I think Peterson's point really highlights the disconnect between like what we might see as logical wartime strategy and the just horrifying reality of what they actually did. It suggests, to me at least, that their motivations went way beyond just practical wartime concerns.
Yeah, he even takes it a step further. He suggests that maybe the Nazis' real goal was the mayhem. He uses this analogy about judging someone's intentions by the outcome, like if their actions cause chaos, maybe chaos was what they were after all along. Pretty chilling thought.
It is disturbing, but it also it makes you think. It forces us to at least consider that, like true evil could be a motivating factor. We can never really know what's going on in someone's head, but looking at what their actions actually cause, I think, can offer some valuable insights.
Totally. That makes a lot of sense. So shifting gears a bit, there's this other really interesting commentary we found that focuses on the role of Nazi ideology in their actions. They were totally obsessed with this vision of a pure Aryan race ruling Europe for 1,000 years, the 1,000-Year Reich. And of course, this vision clashes completely with the Jewish tradition, which, emphasizes charity, community responsibility, taking care of those less fortunate. These values, the ones promoting equality and compassion, they just completely undermine the Nazis' vision of this racial hierarchy and, well, totalitarian control.
Right. The Nazis saw the Jewish people and their values as like a fundamental threat to their entire worldview. They were a barrier to achieving racial purity and, total control.
So essentially, from their warped perspective, getting rid of the Jews wasn't just about hate. It was like a strategic necessity to clear the way for their 1,000-year reign.
That's the terrifying logic of their ideology, right? Eliminate anyone they considered unfit and anyone whose values didn't fit their vision, and then they can start building this society based entirely on their own messed up principles.
It's like what Peterson's saying and these insights into their ideology are two sides of the same coin. On the surface, the Holocaust might seem like a purely irrational act of hate, but when you actually look closer at their worldview, you start to see this terrifying kind of strategic coherence. It really makes you think, it forces us to confront the possibility that even the most horrific acts can have some kind of calculated logic behind them. And that's really disturbing.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's important to understand that the Holocaust wasn't just this spontaneous outburst of hatred. It was a carefully thought out strategy rooted in this perverse and hateful ideology that just, permeated every level of their regime. It really makes you think, how many other like seemingly senseless acts throughout history might have a similar kind of dark logic behind them?
Yeah, no kidding. It's a pretty sobering thought. And speaking of, like, this whole thing makes me wonder, is there anything we can really learn about Hitler's own psychology from all this? He was the figurehead of this whole movement. Can we even understand the why behind what drove him,
That's an interesting question. Trying to get inside the mind of a historical figure, especially someone like Hitler, it's always tricky. But I think his actions and writings do offer some potential clues, like his obsession with racial purity and the whole Aryan supremacy thing. You could argue that points to a deeply insecure individual, someone who's desperately trying to assert dominance and control.
Almost like he was projecting his own insecurities onto a whole race, using them as a scapegoat for every problem in society.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's like his whole ideology gave him this framework for channeling those anxieties, turning them outwards into this huge destructive movement. And he was really good at tapping into those existing prejudices and fears that were already there in German society and, just amplifying them like crazy.
So it was like a combination of Hitler's own, pathology and this vulnerable society that created the perfect storm for his rise to power.
Exactly. It's a reminder, that throughout history, charismatic leaders have often taken advantage of those societal anxieties and prejudices to get what they want.
Thinking about all the people who carried out his orders, it brings up another question. Were they just following orders out of fear, blind obedience, or were they actually truly complicit? Where does individual responsibility even fit in a situation like that?
That's the question, isn't it? It's something that's haunted historians and philosophers for, decades. And there's no easy answer, unfortunately. Some people were definitely acting out of fear for their own lives or just blindly obeying authority. But others, they were true believers. totally bought into the ideology, the whole hateful thing. And then there are probably some who were driven by like opportunism or even, sadism. The thing is, we have to remember that even in a totalitarian regime, people still have some level of agency, some moral responsibility for what they do.
Yeah, it's super complex, lots of nuances, but as you said, I think like wrestling with those tough questions is so important if we want to understand how something like this could happen, and more importantly, like how to stop it from happening again.
Couldn't agree more. Examining that whole thing, individual and collective responsibility, it's really vital if we want to make sure history doesn't repeat itself.
Something that keeps coming up for me as we're talking about this is that concept of dehumanization. The Nazis were so good at systematically dehumanizing Jewish people, portraying them as like vermin or parasites. It's almost like by taking away their humanity, it became easier to justify, exterminating them.
You've hit on a really crucial point there. Dehumanization, it's a tool, and it's been used by, perpetrators of genocide throughout history. It lets them create that distance between themselves and their victims, so it's easier to commit these just unimaginable acts of cruelty.
Yeah, like building a psychological barrier between themselves and the reality of what they're doing.
Exactly. They create this like distorted reality where their victims aren't even human anymore. Not worthy of empathy or compassion, just obstacles to be eliminated.
Well, this has been incredibly enlightening, but also really unsettling. It's hard to wrap your head around just how deep their cruelty went and the twisted logic that fueled it. But like we've been saying, understanding those motivations, no matter how disturbing they are, it's so crucial to preventing something like this from happening again.
I agree, 100%. By grappling with these complex and often uncomfortable truths, we honor the victims and we arm ourselves with the knowledge we need to fight tyranny and hate in all its forms.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that the impact of the Holocaust, it goes way beyond World War II. It's still shaping how we understand, human nature, the dangers of extremism, and how important tolerance and compassion really are.
Absolutely. The Holocaust, it's this stark reminder of how fragile civilization really is. And the potential for darkness is always there. It's a wound that's still healing, and we can never forget the lessons it taught us.
Yeah, for sure. It's a legacy that needs our attention, We can't let ourselves become complacent or indifferent to hate and intolerance. It's easy to just look away from the bad stuff, the dark parts of history. But this deep dive, it's really shown me why it's so important to really engage with this stuff. What about you? What really stood out to you from today?
I think what really strikes me is realizing that the Holocaust wasn't like this isolated thing. It says something about us, about human nature. About the potential for evil. It's a reminder that we have a responsibility to confront prejudice and discrimination wherever we see it.
That's powerful. For me, I think it's that link between, Peterson's observation about calculated chaos and the logic behind the Nazis' ideology. It would be easy to just say, oh, they were just irrational, pure hatred. But then you see how their logic, warped as it was, actually aligned with their goals, how they used ideology to justify what they did. And it's even scarier.
Yeah, no, it is. It's definitely something to think about. It should, it should make us all be more vigilant and really think critically about why things happen in the world, even when they seem senseless.
Couldn't agree more. Well, this has been incredibly insightful, but also, really heavy. Thank you so much for taking us through this. It's such a complex and important topic. I think we all have a lot to think about after this.
It was my pleasure, really. It's been an important conversation, and I really hope it encourages everyone listening to keep exploring these issues and to be vigilant against intolerance and hate in their own lives.